Hello and welcome back to the FL Studio Music Production course. This is lesson 10, where we will be learning how to create our own sounds using sound design. In previous lessons, we've created our own sounds from scratch using GMS, but now we're going to learn exactly what each setting does inside of this plugin and how we can use this to sculpt our own sounds. Let's start by opening the channel rack and loading up a GMS. Let's also draw a quick chord progression in so we can listen to this whilst we make our sound. So let's close GMS, right click on this and go to piano roll. Here's a quick chord progression that I came up with. Now let's go back into GMS by clicking on the channel rack and clicking into GMS. Now let's go into the preset bank by clicking on this button here, going to user and the default preset. Starting with these three options in the top left hand corner, we can see that there are three different wave shapes. All of these are currently set to saw waves. GMS offers several wave shape options. We can see these by clicking on the wave shape, and each of these have their own distinct sonic characteristics. I'm going to go through the fundamental wave shapes, starting with the sine wave. This produces a pure smooth tone with no overtones. It's commonly used for creating sub-bass tones or as a starting point for more complex sounds. A saw wave, which is known for its rich, bright sound with a buzzy quality. It contains all harmonics and is often used for lead and pad sounds. A square wave, which is characterised by its rich, hollow sound with a strong fundamental frequency. It's commonly used for creating synth tones and bass lines. A triangle wave, which produces a mellow flute-like tone with fewer harmonics compared to the sawtooth and square waves. It's suitable for creating softer and smoother sounds. This is almost like a blend between a sine and saw wave. For this example, let's change the first oscillator to a saw wave, and a sine wave for oscillator 2. Next to these wave shapes, we can change the pitch. This allows us to shift up notes, or we can even fine tune the pitch. Shifting this up to 50 will shift this up by half a note. Now we have the mix level for waves. The mix level for oscillator 1 is automatically set at 100%. Here we can adjust the mix level for oscillator 2 and also oscillator 3. We also have a noise oscillator, which generates random fluctuations in amplitude, simulating the sound of natural noise. It's often used for added texture and grip to sounds such as percussion or atmospheric effects. Let's turn the mix level of oscillator 2 to 50%, and since we're not using oscillator 3, let's leave this at 0 and keep noise at 0. Now, this option to the right hand side here allows us to adjust the phase difference between oscillator 1 and 2. 0% would mean that the waves are played at exactly the same time, so they're perfectly in phase. And 100% would mean that they are perfectly out of phase. Here's a quick image to show what two waves being in and out of phase would look like. By adjusting this, we can see that having this at 0% makes the sine wave sound like it's sitting underneath the saw wave. Whereas having this at 50% makes the entire sound wider. Now we have the voicing options. We can increase this to add multiple waves. Rather than just one saw and one sine wave playing, we can have multiple. Let's use 8 for this example. We can then slightly increase the detune, which varies the pitch of each voice slightly depending on how far you increase the detune knob. This is essentially what's going on here with the fine tuning, but instead of doing this for each different wave, we're using it for each different voice. Let's put this to 30%. This will essentially make our preset sound thicker. Now that we've increased the thickness of our sound, we can also increase the width of this sound by adjusting the stereo option here. Essentially, stereo width works by offsetting the phase, which we mentioned earlier. But instead of doing this for each of the individual waves, we're doing it for the left and right output channels. If the sound is perfectly in phase in both the left and right channel, then it will sound thin, or mono as it's referred to. By increasing this offset, we can make it sound wider. So let's increase this to 1%. Here's how this sounds. Next up, we have modulation. This is a very difficult concept to visualize. Essentially, the three different modulation options here, sync modulation, frequency modulation, and ring modulation, can be broken down simply with the following descriptions. Sync modulation involves synchronizing the phase of one oscillator to the phase of another oscillator, creating harmonic-rich timbres. Frequency modulation involves using oscillator 2 to modulate the frequency of oscillator 1, resulting in complex, evolving sounds. And finally, ring modulation involves multiplying two waveforms together to produce some and different frequencies. This probably doesn't make any sense at this point, but to be honest, it doesn't really need to. All you need to know is that sync modulation gives you a sharp and metallic sound. Frequency modulation gives you a complex, evolving sound. And ring modulation gives you a slightly metallic sound, but not sharp like sync modulation. Let's use sync modulation and increase this to around 0.7. Now, as we've been over previously, we have the filter options here. We can add a low pass, band pass, or high pass filter. In this case, let's take out some of the harsh high frequencies by applying a low pass filter and reducing the cutoff to around 0.7. Now let's move on to these settings over here. We have amplitude, attack, decay, sustain, and release. These are super important. Amplitude is very simple, it's just the volume of the sound. Increase to make this louder, or decrease to make it quiet. Let's increase this by 5 decibels. Attack, decay, sustain, and release are a little more complicated. Attack is the initial part of a sound where it goes from silence to maximum volume after a note is triggered. It determines how quickly the sound reaches its full volume. A shorter attack time creates a quicker onset, resulting in an immediate sharp sound, like the pluck of a guitar string. A longer attack time leads to a more gradual build up to the maximum volume, producing a softer and more gradual sound, such as a pad synth. Here's an example of using a low attack. And here's an example of using a high attack. The decay phase follows the attack and represents the time it takes for the sound to decrease from its maximum volume to the sustain level. A shorter decay time results in a faster decrease to the sustain level, producing shorter, percussive sounds. A longer decay time leads to a slower decrease, producing more drawn out sounds with a longer sustain portion. Here's an example of different decays. I'll need to turn the sustain right down for this. The sustain phase is the level at which the sound remains as long as the note is held. Once the decay phase ends, the sound maintains this level until the note is released. The sustain level can be adjusted to control the volume of the sound during this period. And lower sustain levels produce a fading out effect over time, while higher sustain levels maintain the sound's volume for longer durations. Let's turn down the decay and listen to this with different sustain levels. Finally, the release phase occurs when a note is released or when a key is no longer held down. It determines how quickly the sound fades out after the note ends. Here's an example of playing one note with a short release and also with a long release. For our sound, let's use no attack, full decay, full sustain, and a small amount of release. Now on the right hand side, you'll notice there are a bunch of different effects we can use. Distortion, crusher, flanger, phaser, low pass filter, high pass filter, echo, which is delay, reverb, panning, and this gate effect here. Since we went through effects last lesson, we're going to skip these out. because in truth, it's better to add these effects in the mixer track rather than inside of GMS because you have more options and therefore more control over these effects. Now finally, we have envelope and LFO, or low frequency oscillator as it stands for. These are options for modulating our sounds. Let's start with envelope. Essentially, this is another attack, decay and sustain envelope, with sustain being the amount. We can apply this envelope to our filter, which in this case is a low pass filter, or we can apply this to the modulation we used earlier, or the frequency of the sound, or the LFO, which is over here. Let's use this envelope to modulate the filter, as this is the simplest to go through. Currently, without this envelope, we have a low pass filter that is applied to the entire sound. Here's how this sounds with the filter. And here's how this sounds without. What you'll notice is that the filter is either applied or not applied. It's either on or off. Well, with this envelope option, we can modulate this so that our sound might start with the filter on, but then the filter starts to remove itself from the sound. By increasing all of these options, here's how it sounds. This is commonly used on plucks and synths in EDM. They'll use these kind of settings for their chords. Now we have the LFO tool over here. This has the exact same effect as the envelope, apart from the envelope is triggered by a note hitting, whereas the LFO is a constant repetition of this, using a number of beats as the trigger. Let's turn the envelope amount down, and now we're going to use the LFO so we can turn the amount of this up instead. Let's also use this LFO to modulate the filter. Here we can set this to beat and increase this to 1. Here's how this will sound. We can also change this from modulating the filter to modulating the volume or the level. And finally, we can use this to modulate the modulation up here. This might sound confusing, but this is essentially what it's doing. And there we have it. You now understand what all of the knobs inside of GMS do. Of course, some of these are far more complicated than others. It's definitely worth spending time just playing around with these different knobs and listening to how they change your sounds. This will speed up your knowledge of sound design, and you'll be able to create some super cool sounds in the meantime. In the next lesson, we're going to go through the process of creating an entire melody where we use our sound design knowledge and music theory knowledge to create multiple different melodies together and understand what works and what doesn't. Oh, and one last thing, if you create a sound that you like, you can simply click on the bank and click save to save this preset.